What's up? Welcome to Hawkeye's Tales and Trails. Hawkeye is on an expedition to find out what is really going on. Then report back to you with these videos. All information is deemed reliable, however not guaranteed. This is what Hawkeye's Tales and Trails is all about. Please click on the black cat on the bottom right-hand corner at any time to subscribe. Congratulations to the Kansas City Chiefs on their Super Bowl 57 victory. This championship game had several first-time happenings. The first time a military flyover was done with an all-female crew. The first time two brothers played together on opposing teams at a Super Bowl. And the first time two African Americans were the starting quarterbacks in a Super Bowl game. So what is really going on? Black History Month was created to focus attention on the contributions of African Americans to the United States. It honors all black people from all periods of U.S. history, from the enslaved people first brought over from Africa in the early 17th century to African Americans living in the United States today. African American history began with the arrival of Africans to North America in the 16th and 17th centuries. Former Spanish slaves who had been freed by Francis Drake arrived aboard the Golden Hind at New Albion in California in 1579. The European colonization of the Americas and the resulting transatlantic slave trade led to a large-scale transportation of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Before the Atlantic slave trade, there were already people of African descent in America. A few countries in Africa would buy, sell, and trade other enslaved Africans, who were often prisoners of war, with the Europeans. The people of Mali and Benin are known for partaking in the event of selling their prisoners of war and other unwanted people off as slaves. Africans assisted the Spanish and the Portuguese during their early exploration of the Americas. The most celebrated black explorer of the Americas was Esteban, who traveled through the Southwest in the 1530s. The latter half of the 18th century was a time of significant political upheaval on the North American continent. In the midst of cries for independence from British rule, many pointed out the hypocrisy inherent in colonial slaveholders' demands for freedom. The Declaration of Independence, a document which would become a manifesto for human rights and personal freedom around the world, was written by Thomas Jefferson, a man who owned over 200 enslaved people. The colonists eventually won the war, and the United States was recognized as a sovereign nation. In the Provisional Treaty, they demanded the return of property, including enslaved people. Nonetheless, the British helped up to 3,000 documented African Americans to leave the country for Nova Scotia, Jamaica, and Britain rather than be returned to slavery. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 sought to define the foundation for the government of the newly formed United States of America. As the United States grew, the institution of slavery became more entrenched in the southern states, while northern states began to abolish it. Pennsylvania was the first, in 1780, passing an act for gradual abolition. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863. In a single stroke, it changed the legal status, as recognized by the U.S. government, of 3 million enslaved people in designated areas of the Confederacy from slave to free. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 made black people full U.S. citizens. In 1868, the 14th Amendment granted full U.S. citizenship to African Americans. Hiram Revels became the first African American senator in the U.S. Congress in 1870. Other African Americans soon came to Congress from South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Black-owned businesses started operating at the local level, and they included beauty shops, barber shops, funeral parlors, and the like. Booker T. Washington organized them nationally into the National Negro Business League. The more ambitious black businessman with a larger vision avoided small towns and rural areas and headed to progressive large cities. They sent their children to elite black colleges such as Howard, Spelman, and Morehouse. African American inventors emerged during the golden age of inventions and contributed to the leader in consumer goods production as the United States. Andrew J. Beard, 1849 to 1921, was born into slavery in Alabama and gained his freedom when he was 15. He invented his own flour mill, a rotary steam engine, and two kinds of plows before he went to work for the railroad in the 1890s. Henry Blair, 1804 to 1860, is the first black man to be identified on a U.S. patent application. Solomon Brown, 1829 to 1906, worked with Samuel Morse on the telegraph machine, which revolutionized communication in the 19th century. Hugh Mason Brown, 1851 to 1923, was an educator. Brown was especially concerned with education and traveled to Liberia to compare the education system there to the one in the United States. George Washington Carver, we think, was born in 1864 and he passed away in 1943. He was an agricultural chemist famous for improving the lives of poor farmers through new farming methods. Shelby Davidson, 1868 to 1931, worked for the United States Postal Service. He did not deliver mail, however. He worked in the auditing department, keeping track of numbers and schedules. Davidson invented a rewind device for adding machines. Lewis Latimer, 1848 to 1928, was a member of Thomas Edison's research team and later became the head draftsman for General Electric. Jan Ernst Matzeliger, 1852 to 1889, invented a machine to connect the upper part of the shoe with its sole. This process is called lasting. Matzeliger's shoe lasting machine could make 150 to 700 pairs of shoes in one day, compared to 50 pairs a day lasted by hand. George Washington Murray, 1853 to 1926, held 8 patents relating to farming. Born an enslaved person, Murray was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from South Carolina in 1892. George Washington Murray is an ancestor of Representative Jim Clyburn, a current member of the U.S. House of Representatives from South Carolina. John Parker, 1827 to 1900, owned 3 of the 77 patents issued to African Americans by 1886. Sarah Breedlove Walker, 1867 to 1919, also known as Madam C. J. Walker, is probably the most famous African American woman inventor. There are many inventors that should be recognized, but we are cutting it off here. We want to remember some modern-day influencers that are prominent African Americans. Like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks was from Montgomery, and she and King together made great strides in procuring basic human rights for African Americans. Robert Sangstack Abbott's creative vision began many black publications of today, such as Ebony, Essence, Black Enterprise, Upscale, and the Chicago Defender. Ethel Waters entered the entertainment business as a blues singer, then became a Broadway star. Later she became the first African American to star in her own television show, The Ethel Waters Show. Gwendolyn Brooks was a poet and in 1950 was the first African American author to win a Pulitzer Prize. In 1948, Alice Coachman from Albany, Georgia, was the first African American from any country to win an Olympic gold medal. Physician, Teacher Mae Jemison, the first African American woman who orbited the Earth aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour. Henry Louis Aaron, February 5, 1934 to January 22, 2021, nicknamed Hammer or Hammerin' Hank, was an American professional baseball right fielder who played 23 seasons in Major League Baseball from 1954 through 1976. Considered one of the greatest baseball players in history. Muhammad Ali, born Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., January 17, 1942 to June 3, 2016, was an American professional boxer and activist. Nicknamed the Greatest, he is regarded as one of the most significant sports figures of the 20th century. Hawkeye appreciates his activism regarding the Vietnam draft resistance. Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little, later Malik El-Shabazz, May 19, 1925 to February 21, 1965, was an American Muslim minister and human rights activist who was a prominent figure during the civil rights movement. Colin Luther Powell, April 5, 1937 to October 18, 2021, was an American politician, statesman, diplomat, and United States Army officer who served as the 65th United States Secretary of State from 2001 to 2005. He was the first African American Secretary of State.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
The utmost words ever spoken was in the speech "I Have a Dream" by Martin Luther King Jr., born Michael King Jr., January 15, 1929 to April 4, 1968. Was an American Baptist minister and activist, one of the most prominent leaders in the civil rights movement from 1955 until his assassination in 1968. Hawkeye is disappointed that Barack Obama, Kamala Harris, and the late John Lewis were not on Wikipedia's 100 Greatest African Americans list. Maybe it had something to do with their genealogy. Oprah and Tiger were on the list. Wow. What do you think about that? Also not on the list was Don Pio de Jesus Pico, was a California politician, ranchero, and entrepreneur, famous for serving as the last governor of Alta California under Mexican rule. He was one of the wealthiest men in California at the time and a hugely influential figure in Californian society, continuing as a citizen of the nascent U.S. state of California. He was Spanish African and died penniless. Please subscribe. Ruler of an island of black women off the coast of Asia, I am hard-charging pagan woman warrior queen. Calithia. The loving hostess of Hawkeye's Tales and Trails, see my story in episode 120. Remember people. It is not the color of the skin, but content of their character. Thank you to you, our viewers. Google. Wikipedia. Catch you on down the road.